Welcome to the State Regent Memorial Project of WSSDAR, titled as Adopt-A-Regent. For the 125th birthday of the Washington State Society, we honor the memory and mark the graves of our state regents who have passed. It all started with an insignia for the grave of Mrs. Phelps. This was during the term of State Regent Julie Pittman with our state historian, Rayanna Victor. At the same time, they etched an insignia for Mrs. Tolman, setting the stage for the entire project. State Regent Lanabeth Horgan continued the project with me, Shirley Sterling, State Historian, and with Rayanna Victor's help all along. We embraced it. As per Mary Desha, we are good for any amount of work. This project covers the 48 state regents, 2 vice president generals who were not state regents, our state organizing regent, and her patriot, for a total of 52 honorees. Several graves are outside of Washington State: Oregon, Nebraska, Minnesota, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, and New York. So we had nearly 40 graves to clean. This one for Mrs. Kemp. Mrs. Kemp's gravestone has an original insignia etched. Mrs. Neal had an original insignia which was embedded. Here is the Ocean in View chapter cleaning Amy Walker's grave. They are busy at the beach. Here is her portrait and the restored gravestone. I held a little grave cleaning workshop in Spokane with D2, my trifold, and skills learned from Mick Hersey of the SAR. The Herseys helped us with some stones, including the obelisk in Yakima, and some cemeteries cleaned stones for a fee, but some even for free. All the hands-on work, though, was only after proper approval, which usually takes much longer than the actual cleaning. For Lydia Reed, this was quite an accomplishment. Here are a couple families we found. What a joy! Many searches, though, reveal no relatives left. I call our searches upside-down genealogy. We seek out the living, not the dead, and we are getting rather good at it with our volunteers honing their upside-down genealogy skills. Then Rayanna and I reach out with email and cold calls on the phone. Marking graves means to mark with the official insignia. Here you see a variation over the years and by vendor. Only approved vendors can sell insignias, and DAR issues an approved pattern for etching. This monument company made the insignia very large in order to etch the exact detail. Here on Mrs. McCleary's stone, you can see an insignia from the 1920s. Mrs. Rhodes, her parents, and spouse are listed here. Lacking real estate on the stone, the DAR initials were engraved. Mrs. Swem with 2 insignia, daughters of the American colonists, and DAR. What a beautiful portrait of Mrs. Griffin. Vivian Bauer and her husband have a total of 4 emblems. Mrs. Adamson and her sister from a local pioneer family are buried together. Mrs. Schumann has a bronze plaque with a prominent 3D insignia. I spoke on the phone with Mrs. Eggleston's son, who arranged for this lovely marker. The Rainier chapter placed a metal plaque to augment Mrs. Bowden's gravestone. 3 state regents have military stones which cannot be marked by any organization. Mr. and Mrs. Hay share a stone, as he served in World War I. Mrs. Waterbury served in World War II. as lieutenant junior grade in the Navy, equivalent to first lieutenant in other branches. Mrs. Anderson served in World War II as seaman first class in the Navy. Isn't this a great portrait? We were not allowed to mark a few stones due to historic status or for other reasons. Eliza Leary was the daughter of Governor Elijah Ferry, our state's first governor. 7 regents were cremated with no interment site. A teacher of 52 years, Miss Beale, had her ashes scattered at sea. The ashes of Eileen Jameson went to her brother. Barbara Carlson's ashes were kept by family. Lucille Porter's ashes were scattered in Puget Sound. She was the founder of the Seattle Dolls Club, and I couldn't resist this photo. And here is Frances Hyatt, whose ashes were scattered at the family farm. This evening gown portrait is dated February 1971. And here is Honorary State Regent Loretta Kalsrud. Her ashes are with family. The ashes of Sylvia Griswold were lost to the family over 45 years in a snafu, and 3 of us DAR ladies located them for the granddaughter who now contemplates a permanent interment site. 3 honorees needed actual stones: Mrs. Foster, Mr. Palmer, and Mrs. Douglas. Here is the stone we procured for Mrs. Douglas, just installed. Martha Foster was our first Vice President General. As part of this project, we installed a gravestone, and here it is, ready for placement. We placed an insignia for our organizing state regent, Mrs. Crabb, and for her daughter, buried nearby. Private Isaac Palmer of Kentucky and his wife Anne are buried in what is now a cattle pasture. Our state society has a tree for him in the DAR pathway of the Patriots and are working with the local community to move Mr. and Mrs. Palmer's remains to the nearby VA cemetery. And here is State Regent Mary Gove. Her great-granddaughter is delighted, thanks to our research, to know where her great-grandmother is buried. Mrs. Bacon. Our project added an insignia for her interment in the historic Queen Anne columbarium. Mrs. Britton with her newly etched insignia. Her family was particularly delighted with our project. Here is Mrs. Brooke. What a beautiful tribute. For Mrs. Cooper, the space was limited, and so initials rather than an insignia were added. All 13 direct descendants from every corner of the country signed their approval as required by the cemetery. The Lady Sterling chapter marked the grave of Mrs. Deutsch. We were delighted to locate an Idaho daughter who is a relative of Mrs. Dubois and was happy to engrave the insignia. Interestingly, Mrs. Ellis was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. This is one of the first insignias we placed. I love the glitzy portrait of Mrs. Farnham. Here you can see the newly installed insignia. Mrs. Goebel is far away from Washington State. She is buried in New York with her marker to be restored by the end of May 2020 and marked with an insignia. The gravestone of Mrs. Griggs is termed historic, but the cemetery did allow a supplemental stone with the DAR insignia. The gravestone of Mrs. Head was created by the Rainier chapter. Here she wears an evening gown from the mid-1930s. The grave of Mrs. Hopkins is now marked for DAR and Mayflower. Her husband has an Elks logo. And here is Ida Sol Kuhn in a dreamy portrait. She now has a DAR insignia, not yet installed in this photo. Blanche Parker, with a new insignia just purchased and installed. Her home, pictured here, was the site of the second annual assembly. Mrs. Perky's bronze insignia was just installed, and it is beautiful. The insignia just installed for Mrs. Sherman. Here is her grave on the day of our ceremony. Bessie Stevens had a mausoleum burial. Here you see the hands of Maureen Vanek with the insignia before installation. Here we have a lovely portrait of Honorary State Regent Jane Sutter. For Flora Walker, Queen Anne surprisingly installed the emblem on her columbarium vase. And here is Mrs. Wallace and the newly installed insignia recessed into the granite. Beautiful work. Mrs. Williams now has a supplemental stone next to her beautifully restored bronze plaque. In addition, we honored a few others. Mrs. Bailey, the sister of Mrs. Dubois, buried next to her, and Mrs. Phelps, the founding regent of the Lady Sterling chapter. Also, Mrs. Price, the daughter of Mrs. Crabb, and community leader and pioneer, Mrs. Penrose. We have coordinated with other DAR groups in 6 states. Here is a program conducted by the Kansas City chapter in Missouri. And another by the David City chapter in Nebraska. Thanks to all our DAR sisters. Now let's take a peek at random photos of our Washington State ceremonies. Just to get a sense of them, outside and inside. Wherever we are, celebrating well-lived lives. Down in the catacombs of Queen Anne, or in the airy columbarium above. Saying prayers, reading Bible verses, reading biographies, reciting poems, reporting on the project, laying wreaths, viewing memorabilia, inviting the color guard and even the fife and drum corps. Sometimes there's lunch afterward. Here we had a private dining room. Here, a tea and cookie reception with bone china. Inside of a fabulous museum. Lunch at another fabulous museum. Collages and candles. Always a good group attending. We had a lot of fun goofing off. And Hodars attending make us happy. We always have flags. And State Regent Lanabeth faithfully attends. Here was a beautiful outside setting. The family of Mrs. Hopkins showed her wedding dress. Not to brag, but I think the 4 of us looked quite spiffy here. We enjoyed this reading by Nancy and Jean in the color guard. The cemetery provided a tent in case of rain. And we were safe inside for the 3rd program of the day. And this was a day to remember. It was downright chilly, too. But on another day, we enjoyed the sunshine, finding another nice setup by helpful cemetery staff. Della spoke of history and gave the biography. We like to have fun, give out little surprises. Here we are in Longview, where Regent Kathleen hosted a beautiful tea. I wish I had worn a hat. Saluting the flag with the SAR color guard. A recipe book for Lanabeth. Another outdoor ceremony. And special treats from Ocean in View. Here is another big family attending. And more family. Look, the chapter charter signed by Mrs. Dubois. Another nice outside group. Here we see a dramatic unveiling. Finally, a little sun. We enjoy the old photos. Here we cleaned and dedicated at the same time. This ceremony, we even had a violinist. This was a beautiful ceremony organized by Rayanna. Listed here are the top supporters and those who conducted a program. Thanks also to you who helped with programs, attended programs, made purchases, and otherwise helped. Thanks for watching this slideshow in celebration of our Big 125 and these honorary state regents.